Hello, I am Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The biggest challenge facing Southern Africa today is ongoing poverty and inequality. Unless we find ways to fight poverty and reduce inequality, we will not be able to build strong democracies and peaceful societies. As this documentary illustrates, social protection is one of the most effective ways of reducing poverty and inequality. If we are to meet the Millennium Development Goals of halving poverty, now more than ever, we need governments to put social protection policies and programs in place. Money is not the problem. What we need is the political will. Some governments are beginning to show that they can take bold initiatives of their own to give people protection from deprivation. It is time for governments and members of civil society to work together to free poor people from the threat of destitution so that they can take up their rightful role as good citizens.
So what are you really seeing? Riots in Burkina Faso, in Mozambique, in Mauritania, and in other countries because people are hungry.
Now I can buy the rice because the price have gone up.
Gordon Brown challenges world governments to solve the global food crisis.
It's difficult. Even food,
the very poor have suffered.
In the riots, people have died.
It's big news these days. Rapidly rising food prices along with social turmoil as communities feel the impact and look for ways to express their anger and frustration. But hunger and poverty are nothing new to Southern Africa. Despite efforts to meet the Millennium Development Goal of halving poverty, nearly 300 million Africans are living on less than $1 a day. Unlike anywhere else in the world, poverty is not only increasing, but is also intensifying in Africa. And today, the continent is home to 3/4 of the world's ultra-poor, those who somehow manage to exist on less than 50 US cents a day. The traditional response to hunger in Southern Africa has been to treat it as an emergency and to provide food aid. Food aid keeps people alive, but doesn't do much more than that. It doesn't reduce future vulnerability to poverty and hunger, or help people improve their situation. But things are changing. There's growing recognition that poverty and hunger are predictable problems, needing long-term, predictable solutions. Governments, NGOs, and international donors have started looking at long-term, predictable social transfer programs as a way to fight chronic poverty. Social transfers can take the form of cash, food, agricultural input like seeds or fertilizer, assets like livestock or tools, or some sort of combination of these. But more and more, the attention is on cash transfers.
The term social protection might be new, but it's not a new concept in Africa. In fact, there's a long tradition in African societies of people looking after each other, of mutual support. For example, the chief would set aside a field which would be used for the benefit of people in the village that couldn't farm for themselves. Of course, you have remittances, people living in town sending money back to their parents. A lot of other systems like that. There's a long tradition of this kind of support. But of course, nowadays we find a lot of pressure on these informal systems. You know, the impact of HIV and AIDS, for example, has been devastating. Urbanization and other social changes, families becoming more nuclear, commercialization, all of these things have meant that the traditional community support systems have more or less broken down in many places or cannot cope with these new pressures. And that's where the state has to play a bigger role. And nowadays we're increasingly recognizing that the state has to take up the responsibility of providing social protection to its most needy and poorest citizens.
In March 2006, in Livingstone, Zambia, senior government representatives from 13 African countries signed the Livingstone Call for Action. The Livingstone Declaration recognizes that social protection is a right, but it goes further and asks African governments to come up with plans and budgets for their own national social protection programs. While some countries have started to make progress on this, it has often been slow. And in spite of what the Livingstone Declaration says, the idea of social transfers, and particularly cash transfers, is still controversial in some quarters.
Would it not perhaps be better to, instead of giving people cash, introducing food schemes at schools and, say, at universities from that same money? Because then
there is a lot of skepticism about social transfers, and especially about the idea of giving cash to poor people. And curiously, a lot of this skepticism comes from very rich countries which have very expensive and highly sophisticated social security systems of their own. For example, the UK gives about 1/3 of its budget every year to social protection programs. But the idea of giving cash to poor people is often associated with dependency and the argument that the money will be wasted.
Why is it that people who are otherwise quite rational and sensible really, really worry about grants causing teenage pregnancy, that's with respect to the child support grant, or the old age pension causing people to leave work?
And if you could also say something, perhaps, if there's any evidence which says whether a lot of this money is spent on gambling, lotto, that kind of thing.
There's an assumption there that poor people, or particularly people on the lowest 20% of society, like the lives that they lead. That if they had an opportunity to get out, that they don't want to get out. Now, I haven't found any research that actually proves this. It's based on a set of anecdotal information. Somebody drives through some rural area, sees somebody drunk and says, well, you know, people in rural areas like to be drunk and therefore they don't want to get out. Now, you know, there is a significant amount of evidence, other forms of evidence that point to people trying their utmost to get out of the mess that they are. If you just look at the amount of sacrifices that rural communities make to get children into university, it suggests that there is a real desire to get out of the system.
We have anecdotal stories, of course. You always hear about 1 or 2 people that have gone off and misused the money. But on balance, the evidence is that people use money very responsibly.
We need to be serious instead of playing around with people's lives just because they are poor and we think they can be in control of their lives. We have to let people be in control of their lives. And that's what made the Western world successful, because they had social security. They had social protection.
So, are social transfers effective, or are they a waste of money and a burden on the state? To find out, we can turn to the evidence coming out of a number of existing projects and programs.